Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar on audio challenges in esports presented by Cameron O'Neill. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. I wanted to go over a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. However, there is a chat function where you can submit questions to the presenters and they will try to answer as many questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be made available a few days after this presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. And we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series, and you can find that on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses, and all of those are available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Cameron O'Neill, the presenter for tonight's webinar. Cameron is a 20-year veteran of the event industry, having worked at the Sydney Opera House and for Rydell throughout Asia. Recently, he has helped many esports companies in China build their AV systems, including major events, installed facilities, and network audio systems. And now I'll pass the mic over to you, Cameron.
Cool. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this presentation on AV challenges in esports. I'll do my best. I know this is a web conference and I guess a lot of you are also working from home. I am working from home, so my apologies in advance if we have any external interruptions from the children or from poor web connection. If that's the case, someone I'm sure will let me know. Okay, so esports, it's one of the fastest growing areas in live production in the world right now. And that was even before the COVID crisis has forced everyone to avoid large gatherings, so like sporting events. And I think because of that, we're going to see a lot more emphasis put on esports. So today what I'm going to look at is I'm going to start with looking at the basics of an esport production, which is pretty much generic across whichever sport you're going to play. Then I'm going to have a quick look at where the money's coming from. And I do that just because I find that if you follow where the money's coming from in these events, it gives you a good idea of what's actually important to the longevity of the event. Then we'll have a look at the different categories of esports and how they break down and the unique challenges to each of those. And then we'll look at some of the ways that the esports companies and the production companies that are actually working on this now are actually getting over these challenges. Cool. So here is our first issue. PowerPoint, haha, was being slow. Cool. So esports is relatively new. It's only, in some senses, it's been around for probably 10 to 15 years. But in terms of the top level, live level event that's on par with other sports things, it's only been around for a few years. And the newness of that genre has kind of come up with a whole bunch of challenges that until now were never really apparent. Pretty much all these games were designed to be played in your own home. You set up a system that's designed for you in your space, relevant to your space, and you don't have to worry about anything else that's going on around you. You'd connect to players via the internet. You'd control everything that's in your room. And if any of you have been to an electronics shop recently, you might have noticed that there's these big areas with flashing keyboards and chairs the size of your house, different kinds of headphones and headsets that are all designed to, with their own claims at how they're going to make you better at your game. And the strange thing is that some of these things are actually right. The life of esports is measured in milliseconds, and you'll find things like people will not use wireless mice, keyboards, or headsets because the millisecond latency just between your input lag there is too much for these people. And at a competitive level, it definitely makes a difference. But just like there's a difference between playing, soccer or playing catch in your backyard and then moving to the big leagues, there's a significant difference between playing in your home and playing on a stage. So let's have a look at what a modern event looks like today. So the first thing with any sports event, the most important thing, of course, is competitors. You need to have a team A and a team B, or maybe player A, player B, or in some cases, many more than that. This is what it would look like if you're on the internet playing against each other, but that's not really that interesting. So similar to old sports, we need a stage, we need a stadium, we need a field, we need something where we can put those two teams together in the same space. And then, just like any other, professional sports team, there's a support team. There's backup players, there's coaches, there's family and friends who want to see that obviously aren't going to be on stage. They need to be in the backstage area. And as with any other legitimate sport, there's rules that have to be followed. So there's judges that have to enforce those rules. Those judges can be simple people watching the game to people who are actually checking the code and making sure that no one has brought anything in from the outside to alter the ability of the game. So legitimacy is probably the biggest key challenge in esports. And if you think about it, it's the same with any other sport. We see the Olympics has a huge anti-doping section that they will test every medal winner before they actually receive their medals. Anytime that there's a sports cheat or for example, in the cricket, people using sandpaper on the cricket ball, most of us wouldn't even notice that, but it turns into a huge scandal. So the judges are there. Legitimacy is a key point of esports. These areas here is what I like to call the sports group. This is the sports team, basically, that runs the event. And that's similar to anything else. If you go to the Formula One, for example, you'll definitely see that there's a distinct boundary between the motorsports part of the Formula One and then the media part, the broadcasting part that goes elsewhere. The next group, of course, if you want to have a live event, and all of us have done live events, you need to have an audience. If there's no one at the event, then it's not a live event, it's just a recorded event in the studio. But if you have an audience, the audience needs to see what's going on, they need to hear what's going on, so we need screen and speakers, which is pretty obvious. And to run the screen and speakers, as I am assuming a few of us have done before, you need a front of house position. You need to have technical people who actually run that equipment, run the screen, choose what's going to go on the screen and everything else as well. Now, unlike sports in the general sort of sense, if I go to a soccer game or a baseball game, I can use my own eyes and I can see what's going on the field. But with esports, everyone's looking at their own computer and there's not really much to see on screen, on the stage. So you need to have an announcer to explain what's going on, especially when we start getting into the faster paced games, which we'll get momentarily. In fact, the announcers are called shoutcasters in most esports because these guys are super high tension. They've got a high paced event that's going on and they're generally screaming. The level of noise that you get in the audience at an esports event is undescribable, I think. Okay. So the last group here I've put broadcast/streaming. In general, it should actually be the other way around. Streaming is a much bigger part of the esports world than the broadcasting is, and generally it's managed in-house. If you think about most traditional sports, you'd have an OB team that would roll up next to the stadium or the arena, would plug in all their equipment, they would create the broadcast and then they'd disappear. As I mentioned before with the Formula One, it's a different world. But because a lot of these esports have come from that online streaming world, they're used to making their own production themselves. And we'll see in a moment why the streaming is such a big part of this. So 3 different groups, fairly analogous to what you'd see at a normal traditional sports event, but the way things are done there and the way that these audiences and technologies have actually evolved is actually completely different. So you end up with a very unique production and you'll find that there's a lot of things that you would not have actually anticipated if you've come from, say, soccer broadcasting or baseball broadcasting and then going into esports, and vice versa. These people who have come from the gaming world and online world and now getting into the broadcasting world and are finding a whole bunch of challenges that they had never contemplated either. So it's an incredibly unique production. And just to give you an idea of the scales here, this is the 2018 League of Legends final. It's one of the reference points that people use when they talk about the scale of esports. The Bird's Nest in China, if you don't know, was the 2008 Olympic Stadium. It was used for the opening closing ceremonies and also for the athletics. And this is the League of Legends final in that event in 2018. And it was at full capacity. They sold all 80,000 seats. And then online, there was 99 million people watching on the stream and on the broadcast, which, as far as I can tell, is about the same as the Super Bowl. So I hear a lot of people thinking that esports is contained to these small events or exhibition events that are on the side of a major sporting event, but in their own right, these events are at that same level as anything else. So let's get to the basic question, what's esports? They're basically competitive video games. You need to have multiple people playing against each other. You know, a lot of us have played some kind of video game at some point, and there's a lot of these solo games, but obviously we need to have a competition if you want to be able to turn it into an actual sport. One thing that's becoming interesting and just on its own is a challenge is that most of us, if you're in Pro AV and you've done Event AV, you're used to connecting a computer or doing what we're doing now, doing a web conference where people can see a computer screen. That gets harder when you talk about consoles, and it borders on impossible when we talk about mobile. But a vast majority of the games, something like 80% of new games are coming out for mobile. And as we look down at the MOBAs, the online battle arenas, almost all of these are played exclusively on mobile. And yet these are the ones that are popular with the audience. They're, and we'll see in a moment why that's important. But incredibly challenging if you're trying to actually make some content off that. I don't know how many of you have tried to connect someone's mobile phone to a projector at an event, but I know I have, and I know it's not easy. Okay. The industry itself is also worth more than $1 billion now, which, if we compare to other sports, is still small, but it's growing at such a rate that it can't be ignored anymore. So if we look at the revenue, this is the worldwide revenue in millions over the last 10 years. In 2012, we're talking about 130 million, which is not much, but that has doubled every 2 to 3 years now, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing. So you can see here that in 2018, it was 865. In 2019, last year, it passed $1 billion in revenue, and we're going to hit close to $2 billion by 2022. And this graph is actually from last year, before the year had finished, and that was before things like COVID-19 came up and put a lot more attention onto the esports world. We can't have big events, which make some of those major sporting events problematic, and yet esports is still starting to thrive in a slightly different way. Yep. The competitions are huge, and they're bringing in pretty massive audiences at the same time that sports audiences are dropping. I won't go into figures, but we can see a steady decline in things like the Super Bowl ratings and the Olympics ratings. If we look at pure numbers of people watching, as there's a democratization of sports that you can actually watch online. And now that we have the Asian Games that are accepting esports as an Asian Games sport, and the Olympics are considering it, that's only raising the profile. So this graph might actually be underestimating the growth that we're going to see in the next few years from esports. And definitely there's not many other events that you're seeing this kind of growth. So where's that money come from? Well, like a lot of sports, sponsorship is important. Sponsorship here is making up a good third of the entire revenue that's coming to esports, and then media rights on top of that is about another quarter again. Those are the two traditional sources of income for pretty much any sport. If you look at you look at FIFA, you look at the Olympics, you look at Formula One, it's all basically coming from the sponsorship directly from brands to the teams or the athletes, and then the media rights of the broadcasters who want to make their own advertising revenue off those events. The other three, though, are a bit unique. Streaming advertising is where, instead of using a broadcaster as a middleman to basically make that advertising revenue, you become a broadcaster yourself. You use a platform like Twitch that would let you broadcast directly to your fans, and then the advertising revenue comes directly to you with a small split going to Twitch, rather than the broadcaster paying you and then the advertisers paying the broadcasters. And you can see that that's almost on par, and I would actually suspect that in the next few years that's probably going to get bigger than the media rights themselves, which in a different sense is a challenge of where the revenue is coming from, because if broadcasters aren't making money, but the companies themselves are making money, then that's a pretty big, important step. Consumer ticket sales, is a bigger portion than what you'd see in other sports. I mean, obviously you can still pay to go to a stadium and watch your team play, but the live event part of leagues like the League of Legends run by Riot Games, the live experience is a much bigger part of that community building that they're trying to do. And you'll actually see people who've never played the game at all still have a favourite team, and they'll actually go and root for their team in their venues, to the point where some leagues in China have actually built up something like 17 local stadia across the country, so that you're always near somewhere where you can actually go and watch the event. And the last little wedge there is also quite important as well. This is the customer contribution, consumer contribution. This is where someone who is watching your stream, so if I'm sitting in my home watching my team play, I can directly donate to that team or to that league. So there's no advertising, there's no broadcaster involved, it's just me giving money to someone who I like to watch playing. And you can see there, it's also pretty big. That's $129 million of direct contribution, which doesn't have the middleman of a broadcaster, it doesn't have the middleman of a platform, it's just me giving money to a player. That is basically pure profit. So whilst we're looking at the revenue here, if you actually look at the profitability, the customer contribution is the most important part of what these guys are doing. So what does this mean? As I said before, what does this actually mean then for the event itself? Well, you want to have events that people want to watch, and you want ones that people are going to get excited about, and they're going to actually sit there and do those contributions, or watch the streaming advertising, less so than the media rights. And in fact, I would suspect that the media rights and sponsorship are mostly geared towards what we call the exhibition events, which I'll get to in a moment. The flip side to this, of course, is the legitimacy. And as I mentioned before, this is the crux of all the challenges that we see in esports. No one wants to watch a rigged game to a certain degree. I liken it sometimes to the difference between FIFA and WWE. Both big entertainment properties. We should make no doubt about that. But the difference is that before the last goal is kicked in FIFA, you don't know who's going to win the World Cup. Whereas in WWE, someone at least knows who's going to win each championship. And esports is in that divide right now. It could become a fully scripted entertainment property, or it could become a legitimate sport. And the majority of the effort these days and the challenges that are coming from that are trying to push it towards that sports legitimacy. Because we all want to have games that we want to watch, and no one wants to watch a cheater. Okay, so I will stop boring you with business and statistics and numbers, and let's start talking some actual technical things. Esports are basically fit into one of the four categories that you see here, and I'll go into a bit more detail here. But basically, this is in order of the technical difficulty, which I guess is what a lot of you are interested in here. At the top, you have what I call the simulation games. These are things that are simulating something real, like a soccer game or a martial arts match. Then after that, we have a first-person shooter, which is, well, first-person games are usually shooters, where you're looking through the views of someone, a character's eyes directly. Top-down or RTS games, these are the ones where you're looking from a high angle. And then the newest category here, which is also the most difficult, which is the MOBAs, the massive online battle arenas, or battle royales. So sports simulators are copying a real or a real-ish sport. So I lump games like Capcom and Street Fighter in here because they have the same technical level of difficulty. So you usually have two teams or two players playing against each other. And one key factor, as you can see on the background here, is that anyone watching can see basically everything that's going on in the game. So if you're, think about the simplest Street Fighter example, you have two people fighting each other. You can both see what the other guy's doing at all times. Or here with FIFA 19, you can see where every person is on the ground. You can see where the ball is, and you can see where they're moving. So it doesn't really matter if you place the screen behind the players or in front of the players. The shoutcasters can be as loud and as active as they want, and the audience, similar to an audience in a stadium, I'm not quite sure what's going here. I'm going to improve that. Someone wants to annotate. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. I'm going to close out there. Okay, sorry, apologies for that. Okay, so in the sports simulator, yeah, so everyone could see it, and there's like going to a stadium to watch a team. It's very encouraged for you to actually call out to your team. You know, if someone kicks a great goal, you want the crowd to cheer for that. You know, if someone makes a great pass or hits a home run, you want to feel that engagement between the audience and the players. So you have this fairly typical sports environment, and everyone, I think, from the esports side and from the broadcast side is used to making this event go on. The problem, though, is that it's not really great gameplay or great sports. And you'll see I put that there. You know, it's an attempt to balance the realism of the gameplay. A great example of this is the Formula One. They haven't been able to race recently, so they've been running a virtual Formula One series. And during that series, you're finding that the actual Formula One drivers are not as good as people who are the esports drivers there. So it's obviously not as realistic as it would be as a sport, but because you're trying to make it realistic, the gameplay isn't as, let's say, natural or fun to watch as a game that's designed to be a game from the ground up. So, you know, in terms of making a long-term fan base, you're not really going to get it here with the sports simulators. You'll find that if you go and have a look at any of the sports simulators, okay, more messages. Hopefully you can still hear me. If not, I'm sure someone will let me know. Yeah, so you will, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, if you go to a computer store or a game store, you'll see that there's a 2018 and a 2019 and 2020 or a 2021 version of Formula One, of FIFA, of every other sport that's out there. But because of that, you're not going to get one team that says, hey, you know what, I really love FIFA 19, let's stick with that. So let's move on to the next category here. Oh, sorry, let's have a quick look at the event based on that anatomy that we saw before. So we have the same layout. We have the two teams on stage. We have their backyard support team. We have the audience, and we have the front of house. So we don't really have to concern ourselves here. This is what a lot of people think of when they think an esports event. They see the team, they see the screens, they see the speakers. This is fairly typical. There's nothing that we really have to worry ourselves about. Next up is the first-person shooters. The first-person part is quite obvious. So you're looking through the first-person view of the character that you're playing. But of course, each then player in the game has their own individual view. They are incredibly high speed. As I mentioned before, this is where the millisecond timing comes up. You'll find that people will show how many frames they're playing per second, and we're talking a few hundred frames. And people will complain about 10 milliseconds worth of lag from their wireless mouse versus a wired mouse. But a key point here is that because you have your own point of view of the map, you can't see everything that's going on. And part of the challenge here is to actually sneak around the map and try and get behind the other team so you can attack them before they even see you. Also, that means that communication between the players becomes a lot more critical. If you're playing a soccer game or a baseball game, you can basically yell out to each other and everyone can see what's going on. But here you have to explain what you're seeing to your teammates so that they know that they should come and help you or that there's another place that's clear. Also, the game gives audio cues to players. If you're walking along, you'll hear someone stepping up behind you. You want to turn around and shoot them before they can actually sneak up on you. So the audio challenge here becomes a lot more relevant. And when we're talking about games with $1 million prize tags, you know, people are going to pay attention. So if you're the sound guy that doesn't let that guy hear the footsteps coming up behind him or puts in an extra 10 milliseconds worth of lag, they're going to find you. You know, we're talking about 16 to 25-year-olds that have just won $1 million or lost $1 million who can afford lawyers. They're going to come get you. Another interesting part about the first-person games is because the engine is built to give you basically a view through someone's eyes, is you can have spectators basically playing in the game. So this is a character but without a character that you'd use as a virtual cameraman. So these virtual cameramen or phantom cameramen are quite a common part of these sports, so that you can have someone moving around the map and showing you the most interesting point, rather than a player's point of view, which is generally hopping around so fast that it's impossible to follow, even with someone shoutcasting the whole time and telling you exactly what you're seeing. In fact, some of the games that have been running for a little longer, like Counter-Strike, have actually built a special version of their software for tournaments, and that will actually encapsulate all of these different options. So it has virtual cameraman, has a view of the map, you can jump into any player at any time, and you can do an entire broadcast without even having to use any bit of broadcast equipment. You can package it up, make the stream and send it out without having to even know what a video router is. So if we go back here and we look again at our picture, now we can see this is where the challenges are starting to become a bit more obvious. You know, Team A and Team B now can't see what the other team's seeing. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that they can't actually see that screen, which is relatively easy. We can put the screen in front or beside the teams, but now you're starting to interfere with the audience's interaction with the teams. We also have to make sure that the audience can't yell out to the teams on stage. You know, it's just, you'll hear it quite often. You know, it's like the world's biggest pantomime. You'll hear the fans of Team A scream out, Team B's behind you, and hoping that they'll be able to influence the game. The shoutcaster is also explaining everything blow by blow, so they will have information before the teams on stage will, because they're able to see all the screens plus the individual view of each player. So we need to isolate them from that main audio system. And these, as I mentioned before, these events are loud. They're louder than any rock concert. You know, you're talking, you know, consistently 100 dB plus of people just screaming and cheering for their friends. So we have to make sure there's no lag. We have to make sure that there's no audio transmission between the audience, the speakers and the teams, and also between the teams themselves, whilst allowing the teams to interact with the audience and to communicate with their own team. The way this is being done now in the smaller studios is basically by putting teams into soundproof boxes, which is not great. You know, you've got a little glass fish tank there, and you don't go to a live event to see 5 dudes in a fish tank playing computer games. Yeah, you want to see them on stage and interact. There are a couple of other things that come up more from the RTS side that I'll mention in a moment. Another thing that is quite important here is that all the audio needs to be stereo. If it's not stereo, then you can't hear the spatialization of where the sound is coming from, and therefore you lose those audio cues. And now it's time for the big guns, real-time strategy, top-down games. These were the first esports, and they still exist as the most popular esports. The games like the sports simulators will get the press coverage. You know, the Formula One will push that they're doing a esports side event to basically try and attract new viewers. Same with any other football league. But the RTS games are ground up, die-hard fans that have been doing this for 15 years or more. So the RTS or top-down, basically the defining factor, as you can see from the background here, is that you're looking down on the map from a super high angle. And usually you're controlling multiple units. So instead of first person, where it's one person, one character, we've now got one person controlling an army. You'll also see that one of the other factors that you'll see on the on the right-hand side over here is that there's a darkened part of the screen. You can only see, as the commander, what your units can see. Everything else is obscured by what's called the fog of war. Different games have different rules about this, but in general, you can't see anything that's in the fog of war, and everyone's fog of war is different. So even if you're on the same team, there might be some differences there. Some of these games, as I mentioned, being like League of Legends, which you see on the screen here, or StarCraft, have been running for 10 years. And because of that, you've got this kind of really deep culture of a fan base that knows what's going on, that can understand how people are moving even when it looks like the game is moving fast. And so that interaction between the audience and the fans is much deeper, but it's also, the audience and the teams is much deeper. But at the same time, it also means that there can be a lot more information gleaned if the players are able to hear the audience. So back on our stage here, we now have the double challenge of an audience that is much more deeply connected with their teams. So they want to see them live and in person, not behind a glass screen, and yet much more information that can actually be coming out of those audience interactions, or the shoutcaster saying something that's going to be heard on stage. These are the guys who are leading the innovations, and I'll get back to those in a second when we get to that section shortly. The last group is the Battle Royale, or the MOBA, the massive online battle arenas. And this is where it's basically a first-person game, but we have, instead of 10 people, we have up to 100 players playing simultaneously. And because these are the newer games, these are the ones that you find more on mobile. So the two that you've probably heard of, if you're following any esports, is Fortnite or PUBG. So PUBG came first, and then there was Fortnite. And both of them are called Battle Royale because you start with 100 players, and the one who is standing at the end is the winner. That's it. So you've got a lot to follow. It's very hard to know which player is going to come out on top at the beginning. So it's not like you can say, oh, let's just focus on the favorite and two other people, because they're moving at such a pace that things could change really quickly. And these things are so popular now that they're actually influencing the design of mobile phones. If you go and have a look for the Asus Republic of Gamers, or ROG phone, you'll find that it's designed so it can be held and powered and connected to a network in a competition environment. Which you can imagine is quite important, because if you have 100 people in a small space plus an audience trying to connect to Wi-Fi and guaranteeing that Wi-Fi is going to be A, secure, and B, without lag, you're going to have some issues. So a lot of these are done via wired connection, even though it's a phone. The interesting thing, though, compared to, say, an RTS, even though they have a bigger audience, is that they seem to be much more fad-based or seasonal. PUBG came out in 2017. By the end of 2017, they had 3 million people playing per day. Then a year later, at the end of 2018, they were down to 1 million people playing per day, which is still a lot of people, but it also shows that the interest is spikes very quickly and then drops off. So again, when it comes to longevity, we think that probably RTS is probably going to be the way to play. Now, this kind of looks similar. The only problem is, of course, if you have 100 players, you don't have Team A and Team B anymore. You have all the way down to Team Z. Usually, to make life easier, you don't allow individual play, you would allow team play. So you'd say 4 or 5 people to a team. But even then, you've got 20 to 25 teams that have to have their own individual communications, their own individual audio, all set up in such a way that you, as the producer of the event, if you're doing the live or the broadcast stream, can have access to any of those views and actually make an interesting bit of content. There are quite a few stadia now that are being built, mostly in China and India. I haven't seen any anywhere else that are built just for mobile for these kind of events. Everything else, they're basically forcing the players onto PC. But that's like saying, okay, you're a football player, you're the top FIFA team. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to give you an oval-shaped American football, and you have to play the game with that. They're not using the equipment that they train on, basically. And that's kind of the events. This is what one of those events can look like. This is the 2019 Australian Open in Melbourne. And there's 100 players there, each with their own computer, and you can tell that their computers are not mobiles because it was too difficult. The screens are up high, so that even if you tried to crane your neck and look around, you wouldn't see what was going on there. But they were playing individually, so there was no team communications, and also they only followed about 4 or 5 individual players. The rest were basically open players who were not likely to have any chance of winning. So they made the production super easy here. No one really noticed that. It was an exhibition game, so it wasn't like a super high prize money game. But you can see that there's already a lot of cabling going into an event like that. So the audio video challenges. As I mentioned during the thing, we need to mix the player intercom, the game audio, the judges and the coaches for each player. That's what each player needs to hear. The live audience needs to be able to see the screen, and they will try and help their team. I mean, that's only natural. If you've been following a team for 10 years, you want to help them win. Then you have the announcer, you have the shoutcaster, who is yelling at everything at the top of his lungs. And in some of the events that are multilingual, for example, the Riot Games in China, you'll have 4 shoutcasters, 2 in English, 2 in Chinese, both out at full scale, out the main PA. Very interesting to be a part of. You also have sometimes a mix of real cameras there. So you have face cameras or team cameras to show the audience what the team's actually doing or what their reactions are to the virtual footage that's coming from the servers or the virtual cameraman. And if we're talking about streaming, there's a question there. I'll have to come back to the questions shortly. When it comes back to streaming, we also have to think about the positioning data of the audio, because if you're running one of those virtual cameramen, you need to have the audio as per that cameraman, not the audio as per the main audio mix. So let's have a quick look at that. Let's try and diagram that out. I find that diagrams tend to help. So over here on the left, we have our player, and the first thing they want is their game audio. So they're going to have some in-ears for that. The next thing, they're going to have their comms, and they're going to want to talk to their teammate. You can do this through a lot of the game software, but in general, it's discouraged in a professional event. And the reason for that is that we don't want to have the team basically using that software to cheat or to have a secret conversation separate to the judges. So we'll have the judges and the intercom basically on a separate system. So everything on the left-hand side of that red line there, the audio firewall, is what we want the player to hear. But then on the right, we have the audience who are going to yell and cheer, and we have the shoutcasters who are telling the audience what to do. And then, of course, we have the main speakers, which not only have the shoutcasters and the game audio, they could also have BGM. They could also have some other kind of event program audio that we want to have in there. I've shown the purple and the blue headset here deliberately because what we're actually seeing is a lot of players, because that game audio is so critical, they'll have their own in-ear monitors basically, so little in-ear buds, and then on top of that they'll stick a headset. We've tried a lot of things, and I've seen different people try different things to get around this here. For example, really big heavy headsets or active noise cancellation, but let's look at why we can't use those. So the key here is trying to isolate audio that's on the other side of the audio firewall from getting to the player. The main thing that's being used now is big heavy headsets that were designed for things like the Formula One or for airports. So you're talking big sets of cans, big heavy isolation there, and a boom mic. The problem with those, though, is that the audio quality is so low that you don't get the fidelity that you need to actually hear the audio cues of the game space around you. Also, audio active noise cancellation doesn't really work. You know, it's designed to filter out low background noise like public transport or airplane engines. And in fact, a lot of ANC is actually tuned such that speech will go through, which bypasses our point, you know, of having people yelling out things from the audience. The other key thing here is that because the levels are so high, the ANC just starts to crap out. You know, we can't handle the 85 plus there. The way that they're doing it now is, as we saw in the image before, you'll have a set of in-ears, then you'll have a set of cans on top, and then what they're pumping in is white noise. You know, as you probably know, if you pump in background noise, you'll actually desensitize the ears, so it's less easy for anyone to say anything to you. The big problem here, though, of course, is if someone is listening to white noise at high level for a long time, firstly, there's an OH&S, a health and safety issue. And secondly, it's quite annoying, and you lose the sensitivity to your game audio. So again, we have that same problem there. And another thing that we're seeing is that the intercom systems are now actually becoming an integrated part of the main audio mix. We have big digital matrices that are running all the audio, mixing all the audio from the players and from the games, giving the players and games what they're supposed to hear and making sure that they don't hear what they're not, and then basically doing stem mixing from that into the main front of house mixer. Jumping quickly onto the video challenges, as I mentioned, latency is a big issue from all players. Basically, it's discouraged to try and take anything from the players themselves. As I mentioned, a lot of the games now actually have software that will let you choose to watch a player rather than splitting off the video between their computer and their monitor. But even then, the judges, the shoutcasters, the front of house team who are making these mixes, the broadcasting team, need to be able to see all those video sources to make educated guesses on where to actually make those cuts. And when you think about that extra load on the game servers, you need to make sure that that's not actually then dragging down the server by having all this extra software that's running in the background. Similar to the virtual cameraman, they are the most critical because they have to run in the game itself. They can't run off splits or anything else because they're moving throughout the same game space. And they need to be done in a way that doesn't increase the lag. And of course, if the player can't see the full map, we don't want them to see the big screen in any sense, in any way, shape or form. And that includes reflections or LED. And LED, of course, brings in its own concerns with RF there. So looking again here at the video setup, we have Team A and Team B, and we all have a face camera usually for each one of those team players. Now that's got to go out to the judges so that they can watch everyone and make sure that there's no cheating or no foul play. Then you have to have those virtual cameras, which need to be able to move through the game space and also see what the other players are doing so that they can go and pick a nice shot. And then the shoutcasters need to see everything so that they can actually explain to the audience what's going on. And then all of that has to be combined and then put into the web stream. So it's starting to look a bit like a broadcast video router, but at the same time, it has to be a live video router. And if any of you have ever made that divide from broadcast to AV or back again, you'll know that the video routers that work in one space are not really suited for the other. For example, broadcast will use a lot of SDI, whereas an AV side will use more HDMI or DVI or something, or DisplayPort or similar. There's not many companies that can actually handle that central video router in one bit of kit. So what we're trying to do is find a way to have all these diverse systems controlled by one system that makes it easy for the operators to switch between these, but at the same time deal with all these different video sources and demands on the equipment. And a cool thing there is that actually breeds a lot of innovation. By having all these different requirements and different teams and people that have come up from different backgrounds, you see a lot of innovation that's going into these events. And one of them is remote production. So remote production has been a big topic in the broadcasting space for a few years at least, probably nearing a decade. And there's some companies that are doing it quite well. One of the poster childs for remote production is NEP Broadcast. They have remote facilities in 2 locations in Australia and a few in Europe. And the stadia basically just have cameramen and sound guys, and then all the mixing, all the video switching, graphics and such is done at a centralized location. So instead of having to move all the technical equipment out from your garage basically and then to an event, meaning that the capital equipment is stuck in a truck whilst you're moving it around, you centralize all of that. The IP technologies are there, and that's a whole other session, and I'm happy to do one if required, about the technologies that you can use to go long distances with low latency that allows you to centralize the equipment and the personnel. A great example of this is if you, for example, your sound engineer who is in Sydney is sick, calls in sick, but the only other guy is in Melbourne, he can go to the Melbourne studio and you just reroute the facility, the audio streams there, and they can mix from that console there, even though they're 1,000 kilometers away. So we end up with lower capital costs, better utilization. We have lower travel costs because the expensive crew don't have to fly around the world. And then also you have better use of technicians. If any of you have worked in large countries like the US or worked around Europe or Australia, you know that a good portion of your time is used up in travel, just getting from one event to the next. And if you could switch from one event to the next by just going home and then coming back to the office in the morning, you'd actually have a lot more events and you'd have a lot more time doing what you want to do. You'd have a lot more time mixing audio or cutting vision or editing rather than sitting on a plane, which I guess right now in the current environment seems like a dream too far, but yeah, you know what I mean. There's also, on the game side, some advances in areas like Google Arena. And whilst Google Arena is not at a point where it can be using esports, the concept is that you'd use Google servers to run the game, which are much more powerful than what you'd have on site. And then you'd have low-powered computers at the venue that would be running the audio and basically the audio and video only from there, and so the gamers would be able to use those. So that's kind of like remote production, but for gaming. And if it gets to the point where they can actually get over the latency issues that they're having now, that could become remote production for games, meaning that anyone could do an esports event, or you could distribute it across anyone's house, basically, so any general internet connection. And it's not fantasy. This was actually happened last year in what's called the mid-season invitationals from League of Legends, LOL there. It was half planned. So they originally didn't want to send all their crew to Vietnam. They wanted to send basically an advanced team, do STEM mixing, basically then send stuff back to LA. But there was a bit of a logistics screw up. Half the team couldn't get into Vietnam, they couldn't get visas, and a lot of the equipment was stuck in customs. So they were forced to basically do a full remote production of League of Legends. So the only things that were on site were basically the game machines, the game server, and then the local projection screens. Everything else was remote controlled from LA. Yeah, so it's a real thing that's happening, and it's quite interesting to see that they got that spun up in the space of about 2 or 3 weeks, rather than the month that it usually takes to plan something like the Olympics. Okay, so that was a really quick, really rushed introduction to esports across everything there and the challenges that we face in the audio and the vision side. Like all sports, it's all about fairness. We want to make sure that the game is played by top-level athletes that are at the peak of their game, that aren't being distracted or influenced by something else. Because essentially that's what any of us go to watch any sport for. You're either interested in soccer or baseball and you want to see how the top of the world play. That's exactly what people who watch esports are doing. They're interested in seeing how they can improve their own game by watching the pros, or really just watching how much better the pros are than themselves. But as soon as that legitimacy is threatened, like a doping scandal or a cheating scandal, everyone falls apart. So that's why it's such a key point to those leagues, to the games and the publishers that are making the games. So there's a lot of detail put into the AV world. Coming from an intercom background, it used to be that intercom was the last thing that anyone would think of at any event. But it feels great to be involved in a space where it's actually first and foremost in everyone's mind. And anyone here is scratching their head about an event where you think, well, why didn't the production manager think about calling the audio guy, or think about calling the lighting guy or the video guy? At least in esports, they call you first, and that's a good place to be. So I have much more on my LinkedIn. Feel free to email me if you've got more questions. But I did see a couple of questions come through, and I think we've got a bit of time to take some of those now.
We do. I had a couple come in. The first one, is there a trend of designing esports sound systems to be capable of accurately positioning audio objects outputted from the game in Dolby Atmos or Aura 3D?
Yeah, so most of the games these days are actually built with 3D audio in mind. So they're using HRTF, which is the main algorithm formula to position that data. The only problem with things like Dolby Atmos or even HRTF is it's made at the source. So whilst the game systems are capable of creating this, you can't have, say, a different source for everyone who's watching it. So for everyone who's watching the game, you'll have a different point of view. And of course, if they have a different point of view, it then makes it hard to then generate thousands and thousands of Atmos streams. If we're talking about the live audio in the actual hall, like in the arena, then absolutely yes. Depending on the size, at the super top end, couldn't be possible really, because you've got, say, the bird's nest is a round arena. You couldn't get everyone with positional data. But the smaller arena, where we're talking about 300 to 1,000 people, definitely have surround systems installed and will take that feed.
Okay, the next question, do we see a future where a front of house engineer would mix directly from stems and metadata from Unreal or Unity Engine's audio middleware?
Oh, now that, I don't think we're seeing that yet, because you'd have to actually use the engine. You'd have to use Unity or a similar engine to actually do that. But I don't think it's far off. I think the only limitation now is just because we don't have equipment that can do that. Like there's no there's no positional data input to a console these days, but we are starting to see more people use IP audio for these things. So coming straight out Dante or using Dante or AES-67 to connect all your devices. So I'd say the infrastructure is there. The only thing missing really is the ability for, say, a mixer to do auto mixing based off that. So I think all the blocks are there, and this is the cool thing about esports is a lot of the blocks exist, and it now just takes people to plug it together in that way to do that. And whoever asked that question, email me, because there's probably people I can put you in contact with who might be able to help with that.
Okay, the next question, are multiple audio mixers sub-mixed used to handle the player comms, or are bigger leagues using systems like RTS and Rydal to handle player game comms?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, as you heard in the intro, I was working with Rydal for some years. But yeah, you do see those big audio matrices, sort of intercom matrices being involved. So your Adams from RTS, which to be honest are a bit less used because the actual latency through an Atom system is greater than through other systems. So you mostly see the Eclipse HX from Clearcom and the Artis system from Rydal being used. And as I mentioned in the presentation, you basically do stem mixing from that. So the player comms and player audio are all mixed in the intercom system. And then you take stems from that out that go to the audio mixer for front of house of the broadcast.
All right, the next question, how important is it in your opinion that the live audience hears the event like a rock concert rather than have the live audience hear it like the players experience using arrays versus near field distributed point sources?
Yeah, I think you'd have to go for the rock concert thing because there's a significant, and I mentioned the virtual cameraman because I think this plays to the same point. It's like when you're driving a car. It's very easy to get motion sickness if you're watching someone and hearing someone, but you're not in control. If you're a gamer and you know you're going to turn left, you're expecting the whole world to turn left on you. But if you're an audience member and suddenly the whole room shifts, you know, if you're talking about a dark room and the only thing you can see is the screen, it can be very disorientating. Even, you know, 15 years ago when we were demoing some of this stuff in some theatres, we'd have people leave the theatre whilst they're watching these games because we did the full surround sound, and when you turned, they weren't expecting that lurch. So I think thinking of it more as a rock concert, maybe with some surround elements, but using a virtual cameraman to control that view and make it a bit more stable and kind of predictable to the viewing audience is definitely important.
All right, the next question, is individual audio from each player's PC sent to the broadcast mix, or is one specific audio source used? If all sources are used, do you have to use audio follow videos to keep up with the audio source that has been punched by the TV? Yeah, definitely. The audio follow video is a key part of this. You'll only really see that on the bigger events, or if you're using basically a fully software solution, something like a vMix, which is an audio video router based in a computer. AFV is not something that you see in many consoles in like the live event area. So usually in those events where it's a smaller, cheaper system, you'll just have the virtual cameraman and one audio source from that cameraman. In the bigger events, League of Legends, especially, I imagine so with Overwatch and those other big games, yeah, you definitely have a audio console that's a broadcast grade audio console with AFV. And so as the video mixer is choosing who they're going to watch, the audio would then automatically switch. It's too fast for an audio guy to follow. Okay, we have another question. You said players often wear earbuds and cams, but which sources go to each? Gaming comms to earbuds and white noise to cams?
Typically, the earbuds are only the game audio, and then comms and everything else go to the cans. The reason the comms go to the cans is because if you are allowing comms to go through the computer side rather than an intercom system, it does actually open up for cheating. For example, if you have someone who's being killed in a game and is now waiting for the next thing, they could easily turn around and look at the screen behind them, or maybe pop their ear off and actually talk there, and the judge wouldn't hear that if it was going through the computer. So intercom is generally set separately.
Okay, we have another one. How much are you trying to decrease the overall system SPL and room reflections washing the stage versus with array prediction and acoustic treatment?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of these arena are basically done by people who don't have any of these considerations in mind. So they just jam a whole bunch of speakers wherever they can into a small room that wasn't built for this. And in the original, let's call them mid-size arena that you'd see in places like Shanghai, it was impossible. So the only way to really control it was to basically stick a bunch of noise isolation cans on the players. Now though, you're starting to see people really design the space and the system such that you're avoiding splashback onto stage. I mean, if you think about it, we've been dealing with you know, keeping front of house audio off the stage for years. That's what line arrays were for rather than point sources, and why we have cardioid subs now rather than front, omni subs. But the spaces themselves are now also being used to try and keep that sound away from the players. So having the screens working as kind of reflectors to bunch some of that sound out towards the audience.
Okay, the next question is, what are the most common audio consoles used for esports?
I mean, there is a huge range. If we cut away this kind of lower end of people who are just using what they can get their hands on, in the sort of mid to large size, you are seeing a lot of the broadcast grade consoles. So you're seeing the Lavos, you're seeing Stagecraft. Mine's gone blank from there. StageTech is the word I was looking for. You're seeing a few Calrecs and such. But those are kind of the main ones. You're not seeing so much of like a Yamaha or a Soundcraft front of house mixer unless they're receiving stems. So the other way you'll see it is you'll see, like I mentioned before, the intercom system or a bigger matrix system running a matrix, mixing stems, and then your front of house person might be using, say, a Yamaha or a Soundcraft with a Dante input, and they're just mixing, say, player comms, game audio, and shoutcasters only.
Okay, that's all that came in on my end. So I think we're just about at time. Cameron, thank you so much for that presentation. That was wonderful. And thank you everyone for attending. Just a reminder, this is recorded, so we'll send this out in a few days. And we hope that you'll join us on our upcoming webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Colleen. Stay safe.